Okay, Chapter 3, we are going to be taking a look specifically at the northern colonies settled by the English starting from 1619 to about 1700. Specifically, we'll be looking at the Pilgrims, we'll be looking at the Puritans, and some of the controversies surrounding the Massachusetts Bay colony. So, starting off, Chapter 3. We can't really talk about the Puritanism that came to the what will be the United States, what is America at this time, unless we talk about the Protestant Reformation, a little bit of background information. First up, the Protestant Reformation, and some of you guys might already know this, starts in 1517 with Martin Luther in Germany. He was a disgruntled Catholic. He was angry about some of the things the Catholic Church was doing, and so in 1517 he nailed his 95 Theses. These are basically his complaints about the Catholic Church to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. This action really jumpstarts the Protestant Reformation. And if you guys are unfamiliar with this, Protestant, protest. They are protesting the Catholic Church, which up until this time is the only official Christian church at the time. So starting with Martin Luther, he really jumpstarts the Protestant Reformation. But moving beyond that, John Calvin, also upset with the Catholic Church, starts to create his own ideas. His followers are obviously known as Calvinists, and his idea was that God is omniscient. Omniscient, meaning God knows everything. So if God knows everything, therefore God already knows if some of us are going to heaven or some of us are going to hell. So it doesn't matter what you do during the course of your life, because some of us are already predestined to go to heaven or go to hell. Those that are predestined to go to heaven are the elect, or the visible saints, as they were also known. Nothing you could do during the course of your life could change this. No amount of good works, nothing, no repenting, nothing could change this. All you could do is wait for a sign from God that you are in fact going to heaven. This sign from God is known as the conversion. The conversion, this idea that God taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, you're one of the visible saints, you're going to heaven. Now, this idea of predestination or these visible saints really had a foothold in England. Henry VIII at the time, who is this big fat king and he's married to this Spanish princess who isn't giving him any male heirs, he's very upset by this. He is a strong Catholic. He had been named a defender of the faith, but all that didn't matter because he wanted to divorce his wife in order to marry another woman, in order therefore to have some sons. Well, the Pope, who had some alliances with his wife's nephew, actually said, no divorce, you can't divorce. So instead, Henry VIII separated from England and established his own church, the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, Anglican, the Anglican Church. Now, the only difference between the Church of England and the Catholic Church is that Henry VIII is at the head of the Church of England. Nothing else changes during this time. Everything else remains very Catholic in its origin, because Henry VIII was a very devout Catholic up until this point. The problem is that there are a group of people that follow John Calvin within England. These are the so-called Puritans. They want to purify the Church of England. They say, you know what, Henry VIII, you haven't gone far enough. We need to purify this Church of England. There are too many Catholic holdovers. There are too many Catholic traditions that we're keeping. And they were looking to purify the church. They believed in this idea of predestination, and they believed that there were things that needed to be changed beyond what Henry VIII and his successors did. Now, these Puritans, though, had to live in secret because it was illegal to not be a confirmed member of the Church of England. So they had to practice their religion in secret. But during this time, a group of Puritans living in England, who we will call the Separatists or the Pilgrims, said, you know what? Nothing we could do can actually change what's going on here in the Church of England. There's no way we could purify this. So this small group of Puritans said, we can't take it anymore. We're separating. And in 1608, these Pilgrims, or these separatists, left for Holland. They wanted a haven, they wanted to practice their religion in open, and they didn't want to have to worry about living in secret under the Church of England's control. The problem is, though, that after a couple of years, their children, who they wanted to remain distinctly English in terms of their cultural heritage, their language, etc., started to be influenced by the local Dutch culture, the other Dutch children running around, the language, the traditions, etc. They didn't want their children to quote-unquote be Dutchified. They wanted their children to remain English, but at the same time hold their Puritan beliefs. So after a couple years, these Pilgrims left Holland and instead focused on going to Virginia in 1620 aboard the Mayflower. Now, there is some historical controversy why they didn't end up actually in Virginia. The Pilgrims weren't the only ones on board the Mayflower. Most of the people on board the Mayflower were actually non-separatists. But whether it was storms that threw them off course or whatever, the Mayflower actually ended up in New England instead of Virginia like it was supposed to go to. Now, here's the problem. These people on board the Mayflower, they have no legal right to be up in New England. They are essentially squatters. They have no legal right to be there. So in order to establish some form of a government, they create the Mayflower Compact. It's a very loose, crude government that 41 men on board the Mayflower signed in order to create a government so there wouldn't be chaos once they set foot in what would be Plymouth, the colony that they would create as squatters. So this Mayflower Compact is the first form of government in New England at this time. Now, for these Pilgrims and non-Pilgrims, it was a very deadly first winter, much like we saw in Virginia as well. Most of these people died that first winter. You know, they were not equipped to deal with the soil. They had not obviously sown their seeds and whatnot. So most of them did die that first winter. However, in the spring, none chose to return to England. They were sticking with this experiment. And so that following fall, with the help of the local tribes, who later would all die from smallpox epidemics like we've seen before, they created that first Thanksgiving, this mythical first holiday to give thanks that they made it through a year, that they'd learned how to grow plants and agricultural products in New England, and they were actually establishing themselves as a true colony in New England at Plymouth. And the governor of this first colony in New England, which would later be absorbed, but the colony of Plymouth was first governed by William Bradford. He was the governor for the first 30 years of the time in Plymouth. However, most of that time was without a charter. And the focus here, once again in Plymouth, is all about religion. This is just a recreation of Plymouth Colony. Obviously, if you travel up to New England, you could visit it, and this is what historians believe to be, based on archaeological research, what Plymouth Colony looked like once they were actually getting more and more established. Now, beyond Plymouth, another major colony, and probably the most major colony up in New England, was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is a huge colony, and eventually it would suck up the Plymouth Colony. It was Maine was a part of it, etc. This is a huge colony. But the problem is, all those Puritans that had stayed behind in England, that had chose not to separate, they came under the rule of Charles I. Charles I instituted a major crackdown on these Puritans. And those that had stayed behind, who had tried to continue to purify the Church of England, said, you know what, this ain't working. It's time to go. And so in 1629, a group of Puritan merchants were able to secure a charter in New England for themselves to go. And so during the 1630s, this great migration, very, very, very important, this great migration, This is a mass exodus of Puritans and non-Puritans as well, leaving England to come to the New World. Most of them did go to the West Indies, or what we call the Caribbean today. Most of them did go to the West Indies, but many, many, many of them did also come to New England, and obviously they came to New England for a religious safe haven, this Great Migration. Now, this is not to be confused later on with the Great Migration in the 1900s, which we'll talk about later on. So, coming to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, who was the first governor, and he is very, very important. John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The focus of Massachusetts Bay is all about religion. It's about being a Puritan in the New World, able to practice your religion without anyone telling you what to do. And so, John Winthrop, who is a governor, he is not a religious leader, but oftentimes, like we see in the Massachusetts Bay, we're seeing a mixing of religion and government. And John Winthrop, aboard the Arabella, this is one of the ships bringing these Puritans to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He gave this rousing sermon, the Arabella sermon, which is more commonly referred to as the City Upon a Hill sermon, in which he said, you know what, Puritans? We have a religious calling to come to this new world and to really show the rest of the world what a true Christian kingdom can be. We can show the rest of the world how to live like a good Christian. We can be a quote-unquote model of Christian charity. And so, what this City Upon a Hill sermon is doing is it is showing the goals of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. First and foremost, it's all about religion. They need to prove to the rest of the world that their religion is the best and that God is on their side. But also, they're not stupid. You can't live on religion. They're also focusing on economic prosperity. They're going to focus on fur trading, fishing, shipbuilding, especially since there are so many natural harbors in the Massachusetts Bay. But first and foremost, it's all about religion. This government that they are creating, this is not a democracy by any means. This is a theocracy. A theocracy, meaning it's a religious government. Theocracy. And so the only people who were allowed to vote in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were full members of the Congregationalist Church. That's their Puritan church. Full members of the Congregationalist Church, that Puritan church, were the only ones allowed to vote. Well, who was a full member? The only people that could be full members were those visible saints. Those people that had been tapped on the shoulder by God to tell them, hey, you are going to heaven. You are predestined to heaven. And so this is a religious colony. And in their religious colony, God's law is law. There is no separation of church and state. God's law is law. And their primary focus is on this Protestant work ethic. Now, they might not be able to get into heaven by doing good works, but they're going to show God that they are good Christians, that they lead a good life. And part of leading a good life is working very, very hard. This is a serious, serious work ethic that these Puritans or these Congregationalists had in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, this is a map from your textbook showing you this Great Migration. You can see the majority of the people going down to the West Indies focusing on economics, primarily sugar growing, but a large portion of them going up to New England as well, looking for that religious safe haven. And then finally, cute dude that he is, here is a painting of John Winthrop, that first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he's got a super awesome neck dress there. So that does it for this part of Chapter 3, looking at the Protestant Reformation, looking at the Puritans over in England, the migration of the Pilgrims, and also those Puritans coming to the Massachusetts Bay Colony.